Jesus' pain that day was real. There have been lots of speculation, theories, alternative explanations of what happened on Good Friday. There are some people that say that Jesus didn't really die, that his spirit left the shell that was his body, and when he was hanging on the cross, he wasn't really there. He wasn't really there. Some say that Jesus was never really fully human to begin with, and that he was spirit that somehow had a physical manifestation, and so he didn't really die. He just had the appearance of dying. There are other theories that say that Jesus passed out. He swooned, passed out from who knows, pain, shock, a loss of blood. I don't know exactly what that theory says, why he passed out, but that he passed out and so he didn't experience the pain. All of these theories are built around the notion that God would never, ever, ever allow himself to suffer the shame and humiliation and pain of public flogging and crucifixion. But the witness of the church, the testimony of those who knew him best from the very beginning, is that Jesus was very, very real, very, very human, and that he very much suffered and died that day. One of the things that distresses me about life in the church in 21st century America is the tendency in our art and in our presentation of the cross and of Christ to kind of clean it up and make it look, you see, I wouldn't even encourage you to do this, but if you want to punish yourself a little bit, you can go to Google and search for Jesus crucifixion art. And you see this really buff-looking guy, hanging defiantly on the cross with a face that says, this isn't bothering me a bit. I'm God. That's not Jesus, and that wasn't the crucifixion. We get very few specific details in the Bible about the crucifixion itself, and there's a reason for that. Because when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were first telling and then writing about these events, everyone that was hearing them tell the story and everyone that was reading their written accounts had seen a crucifixion, live and in person. The Roman Empire crucified thousands of people. They did it deliberately. They did it often on the busiest street in and out of the city, so as many people as possible would see it. They crucified people to say to everyone, we're in charge. Caesar is Lord, and we're in charge. And if you dare to think, speak, or act against those realities, that will be you. So keep your mouth shut, keep your head down, and follow our lead. Crucifixions were very public. Floggings were very public. And so there was no need to describe in detail what Jesus' crucifixion was like, because everyone who read and heard about it had seen someone crucified. Thank God we have not. I have no desire to see it. I do like to remind myself on occasion what my Savior suffered for me. And so I have found some art that helps me do that. It's not perfectly historically accurate, but it's far closer to what we see in most Jesus art. And it's certainly far closer. We don't have the beautiful cross that we normally have on the altar. We don't have that on display today. Gilded crosses are in some sense a sign of hope and redemption and the redeeming of that symbol of the cross, which was for most of its for all of its existence up to Jesus' crucifixion, and the church's reclaiming and redeeming that image, was a symbol of brutal torture and domination and absolute helplessness before an overwhelmingly powerful empire. these images are different. The one on the right is European, the one on the left is Russian. The artists is their background. The primary historical inaccuracy about these, and I need to say it, I might tick some people off, but the primary historical inaccuracy about this art is Jesus was not white. He just wasn't. We don't know how brown Jesus was, but we know he wasn't from Russia or Northern Europe. And so his skin was brown. How dark, we don't know. But followers of Jesus who have painted him in their art all over the world paint Jesus to look like them. And I think that's a beautiful thing because Jesus is for everyone. And so there's nothing wrong with the fact that a Russian and a European paint a white Jesus. But since I'm trying to talk about the historical pain that he suffered, I needed to point that out. But what I love particularly about the one on the left, where Jesus still appears to be alive at that moment, is the agony that the artists capture and the pain. But they really, even then, don't capture the fullness of it. If we really want to understand the pain and really want to reflect, and we got to go all the way back to the garden, to the night before the crucifixion, when the first great pain that Jesus felt, and this was the agony of knowing that it was coming, the anticipation of a thing, you know that. If you're anything like me, the worst part for me about going to the dentist is prior to going to the dentist. I hate going to the dentist. The anticipation of something painful is in some respects as bad as the painful thing itself. And Jesus had that in the garden. And then, in addition to the pain, the anticipation of the physical and spiritual pain that he was about to feel, he had to endure the pain of his closest friends turning tail and running. When the soldiers originally came, when they showed up and they had their torches and their swords and their spears, some of his disciples pulled out their swords. They were ready to fight for Jesus. But they were not prepared to die with the Jesus who was surrendering. And when Jesus said, "Put down your swords," and he healed the soldier that one of them had struck, they took off. And they left him alone. They were ready to fight. They were not so ready to die. And Jesus was taken by the soldiers. He was taken to a trial that was a kangaroo court. If you look at the rules that the Sanhedrin had, which was the highest Jewish court in the land at that time, if you look at the rules, their own rules of the day, they violated those rules in how they conducted this trial. They brought in false witnesses who gave false testimony, and they couldn't even agree on their false testimony. And it wasn't until Jesus himself acknowledged that he was the Son of God that they had, okay, now we can convict. And they convicted him. But before the trial even began, they started beating him up. They put a blindfold over his eyes, maybe over his whole head, and they punched him and they mocked him. "Hey, prophet, tell us who's hitting you." And they were not little nice slaps and pats. They were punching him as hard as they could punch him, and shaming him and mocking him and ridiculing him. And then once they had their confession and they had their verdict and they took him to Pilate, and we're not even going to talk about Herod today. There was a whole side thing where he went to Herod, but we're going to skip over that and focus on that time with Pilate. And Pilate said, "You know what? I really don't think this guy deserves to die, but I don't care enough to keep him alive." And he offered to surrender Barabbas to them, to let Barabbas go. But Jesus then had to suffer another indignity, which all of the people who just a few days before had hailed him as king, had praised him as the Son of David, had acknowledged him as the Messiah, now said, "Crucify him, give us Barabbas." Barabbas was an insurrectionist. Barabbas was willing and wanted to lead a fight, a violent rebellion against the Romans. That's the Messiah they wanted. Someone that would stand up and fight, not someone who would lay down and die. And all those people that said he loved him, all those people who knew of the miracles that he'd done, the healing, the casting out of the demons, the raising people from the dead, said, "We don't want him, crucify him." And so Pilate said, all right, we'll scourge him first. That's all it says in the Bible. It says Pilate sent him to be scourged. Scourging was a brutal thing when done by the Romans. They used a whip. The slang term for it was a cat of 9 tails. It was a leather whip with 9 thongs on it. And again, we see these things and it's like they're patting Jesus hard on the back. And that's not how it worked. They would take these thongs and they would bed in the length of each of those thongs bits of rock or glass or broken pottery, pieces of metal, anything to make it hard and sharp. And they would dip it in blood to make it sticky. And then they took Jesus to the place in the courts of Pilate where they did the public floggings, because the purpose, remember, of all of these things was to humiliate someone publicly so no one else would dare follow this person. And they took him there, and whether they tied him up with his hands stretched up high or tied him over like this, they tied him and stretched out the skin on his back nice and tight. And then this Roman soldier, who was ticked as all get out anyway, he wasn't from Israel. In his opinion, that place was the armpit of the Roman Empire. It was a cesspool. There were people constantly in rebellion, all of these religious freaks all over the place. He was far from home, he was far from his family, and he had guard duty, and he got every once in a while the opportunity to let out his rage and his frustration and his anger on some poor sap who was stupid enough to stand up against the empire. And it was his job. And Roman soldiers were very good at their job. They were very well trained. And he stood back and he measured the distance and he brought that thong, he brought that flail, that scourge down on Jesus' back, and those tongs wrapped around his side, and with the blood and the metal and the rocks and the stones, it bit. And then that guard would twist his arm and jerk and pull the whip back, and with it huge chunks of Jesus' flesh. Now, Jewish law was this, that God had said, if you're going to whip someone no more than 40 times, because they didn't want to accidentally violate God's law, their policy was to only do 39 lashes. Only do 39 lashes. The Romans had no such law. Many people that were to be crucified died during the scourging. There are accounts of the flesh being torn so badly that people's intestines fell out and spilled out onto the ground. So we don't know how many times they scourged Jesus. We don't know. But it wouldn't have taken long for that guard working on one side to run out of sound flesh, so he would flex his muscles, walk around, and work on the other side. And then he would work his way down his legs and up his legs. And then if he wasn't done, he'd throw him over on his back and start on his front. And they soaked him in blood, and his own gore, and his flesh was shredded by that scourge. And then to mock him and ridicule him, somewhere they got, and one account says it was from Herod himself, some royal purple robes, and they put him on Jesus, and they gave him a crown. They made a crown. They took thorns, big old Judean thorns, hard as nails, wrapped him into a crown, and when we see the pictures, it's always sitting nicely on Jesus' head. But if we read the text carefully, we hear that they put the crown of thorns on his head, then they took rods, and they beat him on the head with it. And they beat that crown down into his skull. And the blood was pouring down his face. And they got down on their knees and they bowed to him as king, mocking him and ridiculing him and humiliating him. And that was the purpose, to humiliate him, to shame him, so that everyone watching on would say, there's no way, whatever we thought about him, there is no way he's the Messiah. There is no way he's the Lord. There's no way he's the one prophesied. No King of David, not even possible. And that's what everyone believed. And they took him back to Pilate. Pilate said to the crowd, "This is bad. Is this enough? Is this enough? I can let him go now. This is bad. I think he's done. I can let him go now." And they said, "No, that's not enough. Crucify him. Crucify him. Crucify him. Crucify him." The crowd chanted over and over and over again until Pilate said, "Fine, crucify him. What do I care?" So they took Jesus from there. And they took that robe that they'd put over him when he was all bloody, and they ripped it off and opened all of those wounds all over again. And they put the cross on his shoulders. And they made him carry it through the streets of Jerusalem. Now, there's another thing that they never do in the art and they never do in the movies, because we have cultural obsessions about this sort of thing. I said Jesus was completely naked through this. They took off. The goal was to humiliate him. And one of the ways you humiliated a Jewish man was you made him parade naked through town. It was one of the most shaming things that could happen. The New Testament descriptions don't say it, but the prophecy of Isaiah says that his beard would be pulled out in fistfuls. That was the other way you humiliated a Jewish man, was you ripped out his beard. And so there was Jesus, naked and bleeding and broken and battered and bruised, with a crown of thorns beaten onto his head and a cross thrown on his back. Now, here's the truth. If you've ever seen the movie The Passion of the Christ, where they put that big old cross on him and make him carry it, almost certainly didn't happen. I don't think there's a human being alive that could carry that cross. That wasn't how it worked. It was usually the cross piece that they made him carry. Often the vertical pieces were left in the ground, or at least left out on the ground beside where the crucifixion would take place. That's bad enough. And Jesus walking through the streets of Jerusalem, weak from loss of sleep, lack of sleep, and loss of blood, and the trauma and the beatings that he'd already suffered, he collapsed. And he couldn't get up. So they pulled a guy out of the crowd, someone there to celebrate the Passover. And they made Simon carry the cross for Jesus. Because the Son of God did not have the strength to go on his own. And he still had to walk. And he walked up to Golgotha, steep hill, the way of sorrows it was known. He walked up to Golgotha, and they threw that crossbeam down on the ground, and they threw Jesus down on top of it, and they stretched out first one hand, and they drove a nail through it. Different art paints it in different ways. We don't know for sure exactly where in his hand it was. We know that the definition of the word hand included about from there up. So it could have been here between the two bones in his wrist. It could have been through his palm. We don't know. I wouldn't want it either way. And then they stretched out the other and they nailed it down. Romans did crucifixion a lot of different ways. Their job was to torture and punish and humiliate. They didn't have a guidebook that said you have to do it this way. Sometimes they tied people to a cross. Sometimes they nailed people to a cross. Sometimes they might have done both. Sometimes the crosses were like we see them. They look like an X. Sometimes the crosses look like a T. We got an example of each up here tonight. But once they nailed his hands, then they put his feet one over the other or on either sides of the wood, and they drove nails through his feet as well. And they picked up that cross and they dropped it into a hole in the ground. And the Son of God, the creator of every person that had abandoned him, betrayed him, left him, and tortured him, and was now killing him, the creator of every one of those people, hung, nailed to a cross, suspended between the heavens that he had made and the earth that he had made, on a tree that he had made. For 6 hours, Jesus hung there like that. From 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. It's a long time. It's a long time. And most people that were crucified stayed up there. Well, many of them stayed up there for days, 2 or 3 days, before they finally died. Jesus died much more quickly than that. It's why they were going to come break their legs. The story, the Romans, they didn't want, the Jewish folks didn't want people hanging on the cross on the Sabbath. They couldn't come down until they were dead, so they would come and break their legs. How did that kill them quicker? Because when you're hanging on a cross and you relax your knees, all of your weight is on your arms. And when that happens, the muscles of your diaphragm tighten and spasm and constrict, and you can't breathe. And so the only way Jesus could breathe was to put all of his weight on those nails in his feet and stand up on those nails so he could gasp a few lungsfuls of air. And it was at moments like that Jesus used that air to say things like, "Forgive them, Father. They don't know what they're doing." It was at moments like that he gasped out things like, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." And my God, why have you forsaken me? Because in the end, that's what happened. Even his Father in heaven turned his back on him. Because the pain that Jesus was feeling, as bad as the physical pain was, that wasn't all that he was feeling. He was feeling the weight and the pain and the shame and the vile, vitriolic disgust of every sin that every person ever had or ever would commit was poured onto him. And his Father turned away. And Jesus hung there like that. Until at last he lifted himself one final time and breathed out, "It is finished." And I love this. I don't know if this is making too much of a word. Sometimes preachers make too much of a word. And this might be reading too much into it. But I heard this a long time ago, and I'd like to think it's true. That by saying he gave up his ghost, it was Jesus' final act of saying, "I am not a victim. I'm choosing when to die, and I choose now." His spirit wasn't taken from him. He gave it up. And we do know that he went through all of this. He went through all of this willingly. Willingly. For every human being who had ever drawn breath or ever would draw breath, Jesus did this. He took our sin, our shame, our guilt, our brokenness upon himself. And the one who had never sinned became sin. The one who was the most perfect human ever to live was broken for us. This whole series has been on the cost of love, the pain of loss, the pain of death, the gift of lament. This is the cost of love. This is the price that God was willing to pay, that Jesus was willing to pay to love us. This is how we know what love is. Love is not the romantic nonsense that exists in movies, TV show, literature, and every pop song since like ever. Mushy feelings are not love. Even strong emotion is not love. This is love. I'll do this for you so that I can be reconciled with you and you can be reconciled with me. I'll do this for you to clean up all of the mess that is on earth. I'll do this. I'll take all of it on me so that we can be together forever. This is love. This is how we know what love is. It's not that we love Jesus. It's that Jesus loved us and endured the torment of the flogging and the rejection and the crucifixion and the sin and the disgrace and the shame. He endured it for us so that we might be reconciled to God and to each other. That's the love. That's the love. And as we reflect on this and the reality of this, we cannot forget that Jesus said to us, if you want to follow me, you must deny yourself daily. Take up your cross and follow me. As an author, the times when I need it most, my brain goes blank on names. It happens with everyone. People I know, people I don't know. I can't tell you the name of the author. I know the name of the author. It's stuck somewhere inside. But late early 1900s, somewhere around in there, he made this statement. It was at a time when culturally Christianity was coming under great disrepute. There were lots of challenges from scientific world, lots of challenges from philosophical and sociological directions, lots of challenges against Christianity. And people pointed at Christians and said, yeah, we don't think it's really real because we see how these people are. And this author said, Christianity has not been tried and found wanting. Christianity has been found hard and left untried. And I think there's way too much truth in that statement. This is hard. This is hard. But Jesus said, reconciliation with God and each other is worth this. It's worth this. And I want my people to be willing to endure this kind of suffering, to be reconciled with each other and with God and the folks out there in the world around you. Jesus could have led an armed rebellion with an army of angels against the Roman Empire, but he didn't. Instead, he denied himself. He took up his cross and he died. And he looks down through the ages and says to us, follow me. Follow me. And sometimes when following Jesus, we're going to suffer. And we might even die. Good news that we know, Jesus' first followers didn't, but we know is that Sunday's coming. Easter's coming. Jesus comes back. We'll talk about that on Sunday. And there's a resurrection waiting all of us. But it still hurts to die. It still hurts to take up our cross. There's still shame and humiliation and disgrace in that that's often very public. But this is what Jesus calls us to. And if we enter into the Christian life with that mindset, then when the pain and the suffering comes, we can remember that we're sharing in the suffering of Jesus. And it doesn't make it hurt less, but it can help carry us through it. It can help carry us through it. Because sometimes God shields us from pain and suffering, and sometimes God walks with us through the pain and the suffering. I got to check my time. I'm long-winded. I got a couple minutes. So I got to say this too. What I'm about to share is a theory that I first heard from someone else whose name I can't remember. I can tell you that he looks like Homer Simpson, and his kids are in fact named Bart and Lisa. He's very famous. I've heard him speak live and in person. Cannot remember his name. I can see him in my head. So when I forget your name, I forget the name of famous people too. So just so you know. He pointed this out, and I've been fascinated by this notion that if it is true, as science and mathematics, really smart people a lot smarter than me who don't forget names, say is true, that space and time are a continuum, that they are tied together, that they are linked. That means that God, who is outside of space, and is also outside of time. And that means more. The notion that God is eternal is more than just that God lives a really, really, really long time. It means that linear time, God is not bound by linear time. For us, there's a present is the only time we can exist, and there's a past that we can remember and a future that we can anticipate, but both of those things are inaccessible to us, not to God. Because God is outside of space and outside of time. That's how God can be everywhere all the time. Because God is not bound by linear time. If that's true, Jesus didn't just hang on the cross for 6 hours. Jesus has always been on the cross and will always be on the cross. That is a part of his real experience now and forever, is suffering so that we can be with him and he can be with us. No matter how much we suffer, we'll never suffer that much. But Jesus says sometimes we're going to have to suffer. But I'll be there with you. I'll be there with you when you're suffering.